Okay, Dan, welcome back. Do you see us
Yeah.
now?
Yes, everything's good. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this program. I am Lai Yi Leong. I'm a fellow at the Center for Presidential History and also its Article 2 Society Program Director. Um, Thank you for participating at such short notice. We figured that, like many of us, everybody here has lots of questions about um, what's going on over in Ukraine and Russia. And we are so fortunate to have experts at SMU who have spent a good part of their career studying um, the Ukraine and Russia and all the various dimensions and perspectives that emanate from that region. So I want to thank also our speakers for today, Professor Orlovsky and Professor Khan, for agreeing to be here at short notice and take questions from our Article 2 Society supporters. And I also want to welcome Dr. Engel's graduate students who are joining us as well. Jeff Engel, unfortunately, is not able to be here today, but he sends his greetings. So I'm going to just turn right over to Paul Beringer, who is a postdoc at the Center for Presidential History and who is a Russian historian as well. So Paul, take it away.
Thank you very much, Lai. As Lai said, I'm a postdoc. I'm a fellow here at the Center for Presidential History. And in my other life outside the center, I have a job that is tangentially connected to the Defense Department. So I have to announce at the top that my opinions do not reflect those of the Department of Defense or the United States government. And with that, we can get started with the program. One thing I wanted to spotlight before we get to our conversation here is that the Center for Presidential History has been running an oral history project on US-Russian relations, focusing on the George W. Bush administration and the first two Putin terms. And we've been able to interview over a dozen US officials now and about half a dozen Russian officials and people connected to the kind of elite circles in Russia. And we've started publishing those transcripts on our website, which you can see on your screen here. We've got about 9 up right now. I think we've got 3 more coming this week, and we're going to continue to roll these out, especially with the recent events in Ukraine. The people everyone up here we have done interviews with, and the people who are in blue, you can click on and go to their particular interview, watch it, or download the transcript. And in the Russian cases, there's a translation as well. So I'd encourage all of you to check that out for some context on events in Ukraine. I'd also like to give a brief shout out of thanks to our research assistant undergraduate, Benjamin Feinstein, who is in the crowd here. So he's done a lot of great work on this project. And with that, I will introduce our speakers here. A couple other things to note. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I've just put the link to the oral history website up there. Otherwise, you can use the raise hand function, and that'll make sure that we see you and can have you ask your question directly to the experts here. So I'd like to introduce Professor Daniel Orlovsky, who is the professor and George Buhi Research Fellow in Russian Studies in the Clements Department of History. He is the author of several books, including an upcoming volume on Russia's Democratic Revolution. And he's one of the rare scholars who's written authoritatively on the imperial period, the revolutionary period, and the Soviet period. Our other speaker is Professor Jeffrey Kahn, Professor of Law at SMU. He is University Distinguished Professor, Robert G. Story Distinguished Faculty Fellow, and Professor of Law at SMU Dedman School of Law. And he has pulled off the rare double whammy of having a PhD and a JD. And his first book was was titled Federalism, Democratization, and the Rule of Law in Russia. And it speaks directly to some of these issues about the breakup of the Soviet Union and how Russia views its modern day borders. So with that, I think we'll get the conversation started with somewhat of a broad question and encourage everybody to jump in as we go along here. So first, I'd like to ask Professor Orlovsky to comment on Ukraine's place in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and the history of the history of Ukrainian and Russian relations in this earlier period of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. And then we'll have Professor Kahn comment on the Ukraine as the Soviet Union dissolved and kind of in the post-Soviet era, how Ukraine figures into Russia's view of the world.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, the kind introduction. You've asked a huge question, and I just want to use Putin's article about Ukraine that he published back in July, which shocked a lot of people, and then again in his speeches in the past week, where he's repeated these themes, and he's in both of these right to exist separately from Russia. He's given a kind of distorted history of the relationship between these two places, and has even blamed Lenin and the Bolsheviks for the choices they made at the end of the Russian Revolution that increased the likelihood of Ukrainian separatism. It's a totally distorted view of history. It's not new. He's been saying these things really going back to 2007, 2005. And what is new is the harsh, vulgar, crude nationalism. It's kind of metastasized into something very different. He's taken it up several notches and turned it into a war, basically, now to not answer security concerns that might have been on the table for negotiation. We can talk about that later. But it looks like very much to deny Ukrainian independence, statehood, make it disappear within Russia once again. And this is very frightening to me, and obviously to a lot of other people who didn't predict really this particular metastasization, if I've gotten that correct. So with that said, just a couple of words about the past. Both countries share a past going back over 1,000 years to something we call Kievan Rus, which really had nothing to do with either Ukraine or Russia, because those are modern concepts. And I would preface all of this by saying that nationalism of any sort is a fluid, historical, conditioned concept. Nationhood is conditioned, it's historical, it changes over time. Russia was not a term used until Peter the Great declared a Russian empire in the early 18th century, and certainly Ukraine, which has a claim on this long past because of geography, also didn't exist. And we don't have time here to go into what this was all about. Basically, a trading set of principalities brought into the realm of history by the Vikings who came down from the north. And, it was the Muscovite princely dynasty and the Orthodox Church in their writings who told this story to become part of Russian history 500 years after the fact. So that's the first thing. Both of these nations, and we have to admit that Ukraine is a nation, share some past. And the past went on for centuries. We could talk about the 17th century, the rebellion of the hetman of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, 1649, the treaty he signed in 1654, which linked Ukraine or proto-Ukraine to Russia. We can talk about Hetman Maziepa in 1708, the Battle of Poltava, where he sided with the Swedes, and the Russians saw this as a stab in the back. The trope of the Ukrainians as traitors, the Cossack, the Hetman host again. Catherine the Great, later in the century, absorbing the Hetmanate into the Russian Empire totally. And then a little bit later, Crimea as well in 1783. The kinds of nationalism that existed, romantic nationalism in the 19th century, where Ukrainians, largely intellectuals, began to think of themselves again as a nation in the wake of, again, the French Revolution. And they began to develop a literary canon and their language separate from Russian. And then up until World War I and the Revolution and the Civil War. Now, nationalism is bred in those conditions: war, revolution, civil war, and Ukraine was no different. The Russian Empire was fighting Austria-Hungary, the Habsburgs, and Germany, and they wanted to reclaim the western parts of the Ukrainian historical space. And they did so at least once in that war. And after the February Revolution, they had to give it up, of course. They were thrown out of there later in the war. But after the February Revolution, Ukraine sought autonomy. And eventually, after the October Revolution, for a little while became independent. It was then occupied by Germany. It was divided and wound up as a Soviet republic under the guise of the Korenizatsiya policy of Stalin, which was to promote nationality in the hopes of defanging nationalism and in restoring the empire. One other point I'd like to make before I go a little bit further with this is that not only is nationalism a kind of thing that builds out of war and revolution, but in the Soviet case, it was always there as a kind of alternative to Muscovite centralization, to centralization from Moscow. So this affirmative action empire existed, and then the next stage of all this was the Great Famine in the early 1930s, where Russia, the Soviet state, has been accused of a genocide against Ukraine. The absorption of the western part of Ukraine again in 1940 as a result of the pact with Hitler, and then bringing us up to Gorbachev era Chernobyl, which also was a source of the growth of nationalism on Ukrainian territory. And of course, the whole nationality question. And here I would just say that recent scholarship tends to argue that the nationality question, more than anything else, undid the Soviet Union, and that Ukraine was pivotal in that, and that the United States under President Bush, George H.W. Bush, at first supported keeping the Soviet Union together and went against Ukrainian instincts toward independence. But then after the coup, the failed coup in August, switched and kind of pulled the rug out from under Gorbachev, at least that's the way he looked at it, by siding with the thirst of the Ukrainians for independence. And indeed, Ukraine became an independent country, a real independent country with a real history. And Mr. Putin wants to deny this and wants to claim that there can't be a Ukraine apart from Russia, that you can't tear Ukraine away from Russia, that he's not going to allow this to happen. He's prepared to shed blood to reverse history here. And this is a turning point in history, it seems to me, because it's a question of whether Ukraine has the right to be a nation and to opt for a Western orientation, and whether arms can be allowed to solve this question internationally. And we'll get into later the question of what Putin's strategic aims are. But that's all I have to say as introduction.
And Professor Khan, do you want to talk a little bit about how your research on federalism and that issue kind of dovetails with what's happening now and what happened in the 1990s?
I'd be happy to, and thank you, Paul, for and Lai for convening us. And I couldn't ask for a better, more succinct introduction than this masterful recitation of Russian history from Kievan Rus through the imperial period into the revolution and the Soviet period, and then the post-Soviet period, than what my colleague and friend, Professor Orlovsky, has given us. So let me build off of that and just say about 5 minutes worth of remarks, because I don't want to take away from our discussion. One of the slogans in the revolution and in the Bolshevik period was release from the prison house of nations, that the Bolshevik plan was going to release and free the oppressed peoples of Imperial Russia. And in one of the ironies of history, there was not only not a release, but I'd say a re-securitizing, and sometimes even a creation of more nations under control in what became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So if we start with the question of Ukraine's place in Soviet and post-Soviet worlds, we can end with Putin's goal, which is essentially to put Ukraine back in its place, to put Ukraine back in a place of subordination and control, or by Moscow, or at the very least, to deprive the West, as he conceives the West, of the ability to integrate and bring Ukraine into a more pro-Western orientation, either economically or from a defense or strategic standpoint. So the first point I want to make is that the creation of the Soviet Union, and when we think about that creation, we have to remember that the first commissar of nationalities was Joseph Stalin, before he went on to bigger and more horrific things, was to organize and create a system that brought together different ethnic groups and regions into this Soviet space, even though we tend to collapse and reduce our understanding by referring collectively to the USSR as Russia. It's a misnomer, because many of the groups, including Ukraine, were not Russian at all. And in fact, many of the groups were not even Slavic. And in fact, many of the groups were not even Orthodox, but Muslim or Buddhist, in fact. Now, some of the units of the Soviet Union came into creation through their own separate revolutionary groups, but not all parts of the Union came into control in the same way. And so some, for instance, were annexed. And we can refer here to the Baltic countries of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, which were annexed in June of 1940, previously wholly sovereign, completely independent countries, as part of the start of the Second World War. Some units were created, some units that most people have never even heard of, non-Russian, non-ethnic Russian regions that were given a sort of territory, but always kept away, physically away, from the external borders of the Soviet Union, always creating a little bit of a space so that these different regions could never actually become independent countries, but would always be islands under the control of the Soviet system. Places like Tatarstan or Bashkortostan, non-Russian ethnic republics, and now still very much subsumed into the Russian space. But some of these regions sought independence anyways. And so at the collapse of the Soviet Union, we get a reemergence of what I'd call frozen conflicts. There is a frozen conflict between Russia and various ethnic groups in the North Caucasus. And so we have the Chechen Wars. There's a frozen conflict between Muslim Azeris and Christian Armenians, and we get that conflict. We have also areas that are not in violent conflict, but are so riven by the collapse of the Soviet Union that we have a period of deep and almost terminal decline. And Ukraine suffered from that a great deal. Just to give you two data points, to give you a sense of how bleak it was, both economically and in terms of the intellectual loss and brain drain, two of the families that left Ukraine during the period of roughly from the late 1980s when emigration was possible till around the turn of the century were Max Levchin, who you might know as the founder of PayPal, and Jan Koum, who you might know as the founder of WhatsApp. So you can imagine what Ukraine lost when it loses just some of these phenomenal intellectuals and engineers and builders. But that's just sort of a tiny data point to note a tremendous economic loss. There's also a tremendous military loss. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops, but often from different parts of the Soviet Union, including Russia, are adrift in an independent Ukraine in 1991. Where do they go? To whom do they report? There were attempts to secure the loyalty of different portions as a new Ukrainian army. But when this was attempted with the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula, the Russian admiral in control of that fleet took every ship out to sea rather than allow a decommissioning or a reconstruction or a division of those ships. And that's not to mention nuclear forces. 1/3 of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons were to be found on Ukrainian soil. And you can imagine a Ukraine that is interested in going its own way, maybe not even sure which way that is, but interested in going its own way economically, politically, militarily, defensively, deciding whether to keep or give up those nuclear weapons. And a large part of the American foreign relations developing with a newly independent Ukraine was to try to secure, dismantle, destroy that nuclear stockpile. It was given up. And in what's called the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in exchange for a recognition of the integrity of its borders, its sovereignty over Crimea, and other particulars which have now become unfrozen in conflict, Ukraine was willing to give those weapons up. And I think that the world was made much, much safer. And in 1991, if you remember the old Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, its doomsday clock stood at 17 minutes to midnight. That's probably the safest the world has been since the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has been moving that clock around. At the moment, the clock is 100 seconds to midnight. And what do we have in Russian-Ukrainian relations? And I'll end with this. A complete renunciation of the promise made in 1994 to respect Ukrainian borders. Why? Well, Vladimir Putin says it's because that deal was made with a legitimate government of Ukraine. And after the Maidan revolution of 2013, the second Maidan revolution, after which Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian leader of Ukraine, fled to Russia, the government is no longer recognized by Vladimir Putin. And so I think that to end here, what Vladimir Putin wants is a return of Ukraine to the prison house of nations. He wouldn't call it that. And he used to talk about Slavic fraternal feelings, the brotherhood of the Ukrainian and Russian peoples. Today, you'll have to explain that brotherhood to the Russian soldier who was told he was going to an exercise in Belarus and now finds himself on the streets of Kharkiv or Kiev or Kherson or quite possibly by the end of tonight, Mariupol, and is not engaged in very brotherly relations. So with that, let me stop and turn it back over to the guidance of our moderator.
Thank you very much for that overview and explanation of particularly of the agreements in the early 90s on nuclear weapons, I think is really important. And one of the, Putin said a number of outrageous things recently, one of them being that Ukraine is seeking nuclear weapons. That's another reason he's doing all this. Another is that Ukraine is full of Nazis and drug addicts that he needs to, that are, threatening Russia. Feel free, the audience, to ask questions at any moment. I'm going to throw another question out there, which is, I guess I'd like to ask, this a little bit, picking up on what Professor Khan said a little bit more directly, which is analysts seem to throw out, Putin's trying to remake the Russian Empire, but then other analysts are throwing out Putin's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union. So I was wondering how each of you see Putin's interpretation of history. How does it affect his ultimate goals here in Ukraine? You mentioned it a little bit, Professor Khan, but I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Well, I'll just say one or two things. Here, I really have to defer to Professor Orlovsky, who's a true expert on this question. When lawyers engage in history, when they start to put historical claims into their legal briefs, that's rightly harshly criticized as lawyers' history, because a lawyer always wants history to be very straightforward, very unidirectional. All the sources point to a clear answer, and it just happens to coincide with the needs of your particular client. And what I'd say is that Vladimir Putin is engaged very much so in an exercise in lawyers' history. He has a preference for certain facts. He has a distaste for other facts, and those facts we just push to one side. But I think a true historian looking at this space would say, whatever Putin's plan is, what Russia is, or what Russia's space is, or what Russian imperium is first of all constantly in flux. Constantly in flux. Does Kaliningrad belong to Russia, or is it just Königsberg, which seems to have more of a Germanic connection? What is Poland? What is Finland? It used to be a duchy that was part of the Russian Empire. Is that a real country? how long do you have to be a real country? And what circumstances do you have to create for yourself? Very few countries in the world, and none in this part of the world, are homogenous states in which ethnicity perfectly overlaps with borders. We talk about Ukraine and Ukrainians, and there's a Ukrainian civic identity, and I think it's growing and being bolstered. But there's no denying that there are many different ethnic groups in what is now Ukraine. There are many different linguistic groups. There are many different religious groups. And so what is Ukraine is not easily defined by any one of those metrics. Metrics which Vladimir Putin, I think, would much prefer to see in a very homogenizing and unifying way, discarding the parts that he doesn't like. And the final thing that I think I would say is that from a lawyer's perspective, from an international lawyer's perspective, what has made the Pax Americana work, what has made the post-World War II world work, has been an absolute agreement in principle, not always in fact, but at least in principle, that the founding rule of our global order is the inviolability of borders. That we do not seek to reclaim what was once ours through force, that states cannot seek to commit wars of aggression. That is simply and totally a violation of international law. And so what's at stake in this conflict is not just the Ukrainian state or the terrible loss of life, which is itself a reason to be deeply, deeply concerned, but a concern with the unraveling of this rule of law. If these borders are not the sort of borders that we're going to commit to defending because we don't allow aggressive wars, whose borders are next? And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Orlovsky.
You're on mute.
Just, yes, 2 words. Putin comes out of a tradition of statist Russian leaders. He worships the state. And I would then add to that my take on Russian history and Soviet history in the long haul is that the state and empire are part of the same phenomenon. In other words, you don't have a state without an imperium, and vice versa. There is no Russian state without empire. It would be returning it to the Muscovite core of 7 centuries ago. So in that sense, to get to Paul's question, I mean, he is interested in restoring the empire/state. Soviet Russian, in this sense, it doesn't really matter all that much. He sees Ukraine as a part of that, and these borders can be violated in his vision.
We have our first question. Thomas, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for this discussion so far. I was just curious if you guys would be able to expand a little bit upon any negotiations between the Western powers and NATO and the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War concerning an extension of NATO to former Soviet satellite nations. If there was an agreement not to extend, or if that was ambiguous, and if that has any in the role that might play right now in the current situation?
That sounds like a question for the Center for Presidential History.
Indeed, indeed. Having just reread Jeff Engel's book, I recommend you look in there for some of those answers.
Okay.
There's another good book that just came out by Mary Serrati called Not 1 Inch that talks about this particular issue, whether there was a promise or not. There's the issue of whether there was a promise at this moment when the Soviet Union ends. Then there's the issue in the mid-90s of actually expanding NATO past Germany. And then you have the issue that comes up in the mid 2000s, which is the era I'm most familiar with through this oral history research, where the question is, how far do we extend them? And do we offer NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia? And I'll just tell this story before, and then we can go back in time. I'll have you two maybe elaborate a little bit more on what happened in the 1990s. But in 2004 and 2005, there are the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine. And this is seen, particularly the Orange Revolution in Ukraine is seen as being orchestrated. Putin sees it as orchestrated by the United States. And if that weren't bad enough, then in 2008, there's a discussion in NATO about whether to extend a pathway to membership to Georgia and Ukraine. There's a thing called the Membership Action Plan, which is viewed as a mechanism that will eventually bring them into Ukraine. They have to meet certain metrics. And the Bush administration is actually divided on whether to do this. So they go into the summit, and President Bush decides that, yes, if Ukraine and Georgia want to come into NATO, they should be allowed to have the membership action plan. But the problem is that France and Germany are opposed to this idea. And so they go into this summit without a clear, usually when they go into a summit like this, things are worked out in advance and they know what the outcome is going to be. But in this particular case, they decide to kind of negotiate it on the spot very late at night. And what happens is kind of almost an accident. Germany and France continue to oppose offering them the membership action plan, but they work out language that says Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO at some point in the future. So they don't give them this mechanism, but they do make this promise that eventually someday NATO membership will occur. And this is also the first NATO summit where Putin actually comes to NATO and is present. And he gets this surprise announcement that on the one hand, they didn't get offered the membership action plan, which makes him very happy. But then in the next sentence, eventually they will become members of Ukraine. And it's at this point that he starts to talk. He talks publicly in his remarks at the summit about, Ukraine not being a real country and Crimea being a gift to Ukraine by the Soviet Union. And this is kind of what sets in motion not only the Georgia war, but then the actions later in Ukraine. And so maybe Professor Orlovsky, can you talk a little bit more about this?
I mean, I would carry this story. I mean, this NATO thing is highly symbolic and very central to what's going on here. And, I'm a great fan of George Kennan. I kind of used to worship him in my younger days, the great diplomat, and was inspired by him and his memoirs. And if Kennan said NATO expansion was not a good thing in the mid 90s, he may, I think one should take that fairly seriously. Maybe we could have done that differently, but going back, I mean, even to 1989, 90 to German unification, there was a big question of whether, as a quid pro quo, to use that phrase, for German unification, they should be kept out of NATO. And we argued and successfully won the point there that they should be allowed into NATO. And this speaks to the whole question of the architecture of European security, going back to the beginning of the Cold War, and whether there could have been a united Germany that was neutral, and whether there ever had to have been a NATO in the first place. That's a question that we can certainly talk about. But NATO expansion, when it happened in the 90s in the wake of the Yugoslav issues and other things, I saw the point of it. I mean, there are a lot of countries that wanted to be free of Russia and to be safe and to have their borders guaranteed. But, in retrospect, we probably could have handled it a little bit differently. I mean, we extended to Russia kind of halfway memberships, consultative participation, and so on and so forth. But we didn't really, I'm not an expert in this, but we didn't, it seems to me, make an effort to connect them to Europe and to NATO that might have had resonance and might have worked. Maybe there was too much Cold War triumphalism in the 90s for that. And very, justified bad feelings about Russia going back decades, if not more. So it's an important point, NATO. I mean, it's one of these things that, the critics of our policy, the Stephen Cohens, the John Mearsheimer's, others, political scientists, Kremlinologists, who took the side of Putin and Russia in this kind of discussion, would always bring up, they would say, oh, the Russians have a point here. Putin has a point. America's restarting the Cold War by pushing NATO to their borders. And they may have had a point, but again, we've gone way beyond that now, way beyond that, where negotiation on that doesn't seem to be possible at all. And that's very sad and possibly very tragic.
I would just add that given there are 30 members of NATO, so everything that it does, just like the 27-member European Union, takes an awfully long time. But there is Article 5, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on all. And so if you really want to make sure that a country doesn't join NATO, you do exactly what Vladimir Putin did. Take a little chunk out of Georgia's territory and throw its borders into question in 2008 with the war involving South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Take a little chunk out of Ukraine's border, not such a little chunk. Ukraine, the Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Those states, it doesn't matter if nobody else in the world is going to recognize them, just like it doesn't matter that the Transnistrian Republic on the western side of Ukraine, edging Moldova, is not recognized by virtually anybody. But it throws into question the integrity of Ukraine's borders. So how could Ukraine, under those conditions, become a member of NATO when the very first issue would be, we've been attacked. There is an international armed conflict, and our territory has been subject to attack. There are two small other points to be made. One is there isn't a little bit of irony in Vladimir Putin claiming that promises were broken on the one hand, and then saying, I can't any longer guarantee Ukraine's borders because I was negotiating with a different group and I don't like the group that's in charge of Ukraine now. So there's a sort of irony there. But I'll stop there and leave it open for more questions.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience, but before we get to it, I wanted to ask one follow-up to what you just said, Professor Kahn, which is, were either of you surprised by the most recent action, which is, the full-scale invasion here? I would say, based on what happened in Georgia, Putin was kind of following a certain playbook here, taking these small bites out, throwing borders into question and statehood into question. But this seems to be of a dramatic escalation. Were either of you surprised by what happened last Wednesday?
I was certainly surprised. My expectation was that what we would see is another small bite. I agree
totally on that. I was totally surprised and thought he was just going for the Eastern breakaway.
I mean, what would have been of nice strategic advantage would be to seize just the coastline of the Sea of Azov so that you can connect the Donbass with Crimea. That gives you a very strategic port in Mariupol. It means you don't have to rely on this bridge, the longest bridge in Russia now that connects Crimea to, I guess what you could call mainland Russia. The water supply to Crimea primarily would come from Ukraine. And the access point to Crimea is through Ukraine. And so I was expecting just a very small bite, so to speak, not so small to the hundreds of thousands of people who live in that region, but certainly not this massive invasion.
That's why we study history and politics and law, because it's always turning up the unexpected and the outrageous. And, we've seen it in our own country as well, if I may say. So, it's possible to be quite surprised. I mean, I was by it. I thought it would never come to this, because I thought Putin was enough of a rational actor, but he's not clearly right now. And you always have to take that into account. It matters. The Presidential History Center, above all, should know this. It matters who's in charge. It matters that Nicholas II was the Tsar. It matters who's the president. All these personal things have to be weighed in with the structural factors and the social factors in a big way.
On that point, I would.
Oh,
I would just add that I think he took a lot of the Russian observers in Russia, or the Putin observers in Russia, by surprise as well. I mean, a lot of the people who we've talked to in oral histories emphasize Putin's clear-headedness, his rationality, and we've seen in recent days, him making more very emotional types of statements in the press that are not characteristic of his view. But I wanted to get to a couple of the audience questions here. Margie raises the important issue of the EU. We've talked about NATO, but what about the EU? What if, she wants to know, what if Ukraine is successful in its application to join the EU? And would it make a difference for Zelensky if they were successful?
If I can take a stab at this one, there was a very emotional moment at the European Parliament on, I think it was either earlier today or yesterday, when the interpreter for Zelensky broke down. And you could hear the emotion in this person's voice as he was trying to translate from the Ukrainian into English. The English interpreter broke one of the cardinal codes of an interpreter, inserting himself into the story in a way, completely unintentionally, but was so emotionally overcome by what Zelensky was saying that he started to choke up. So on one level, what Zelensky is doing is extremely important. From a political leadership standpoint, he's unifying the country. I don't need a ride, he says, I need ammunition. That's an extraordinary statement right there. The videos that he's made from different very historic points in Kiev is extremely important. And what he asked for from the European Union, I think, is extremely important, but I don't think he intended to get it. Not now. It's going to take 18 months to process the application. It's going to take 10 years for Ukraine to come into compliance with the tens of thousands of pages of regulations and laws that are necessary. Not to mention the political difficulty of leapfrogging over several other countries that have been waiting patiently in line. So it's not that I think he has this as an immediate tactical goal or even as a short-term strategic goal, but to clearly establish a connection with the West, to start those ties and motions going is very important, to set the tone. But in terms of actually reaping economic benefits in a positive way, contra the sanctions that are causing havoc in Russia in a negative way, that I don't think was the goal. And I think this longer term vision is what really, in part, brought so much emotion to the scene.
You want to add anything on this question, Professor Lusky?
No, I just think it's fascinating how Zelensky has become a leader, you know, in the midst of all this, beloved by everyone, as is the Ukrainian people. Fascinating to watch.
Especially considering a history, not just in this part of the world, not to single out Ukraine, but a history of anti-Semitism. Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish, and a history of anti-Semitism in this country and in this region. This was large parts of Ukraine were part of the Pale of Settlement. 1.5 million Jews killed in the Holocaust came from Ukraine. And so there's another sick irony here in Vladimir Putin asserting that the leadership of Ukraine is some sort of fascist Nazi conspiracy.
Yeah. And our next question, I wanted to ask it is there a possibility of the Russian oligarchs turning on Putin and stopping him in a way that Putin ends up like Gaddafi? And I do want to address that particular question, but first I was hoping Professor Orlovsky could kind of address this question of the nature of Putin's leadership and and how the parallels to the way that, you know, kind of the argument over whether the Tsar was this powerful figure who actually wielded power over people, or whether, you know, he served at the, you know, behest of the elite circles around.
Well, you had
him.
both in Russian history, but the main thing was there had to be someone in place so that the oligarchs of the day, and they had different nomenclature, could do their thing. There was chaos when there was no Tsar, and or when there was a succession crisis, and you know, succession was thrown into doubt, or when the Tsar picked up his ball and left and said, "You take over the country. I'm going away," as Ivan the Terrible did, for example. So no, the system very much has required over the centuries a kind of Tsar-centered power structure, but it functioned often best when the Tsar was weak and when the oligarchs were strong. And whenever the Tsar chose to exercise his God-given authority, which was unlimited in theory, it was problem for the princes and the boyars and the oligarchs. So you have a kind of I mean, some people have called it a mafia state today. I mean, you have a number of oligarchs who are close to Putin, clearly, and who have benefited enormously, and you have others who are further away in concentric circles, and others who are the enemy, and he's used to persecute and bully and destroy in some cases, and you know, so there, you can't generalize totally about them. But to get right to your question, I certainly hope that would happen. I mean, I hope that oligarchs, and I hope the people on the street realize what's happening and take matters into their own hands. That may be the only solution to this, and it's one, although it could become bloody, it's one that may move Russia off its path right now, which is this extreme nationalistic, anti-Western, anti-European, anti-American path, which is unnecessary. I mean, it's just, it strikes me as counter to the best interests of the Russian people.
Just to introduce a note of caution, I was watching Meet the Press on Sunday, and I think that this option was referred to as a Julius Caesar option, since the Ides of March are approaching. The idea that he would be, Not to
No,
put
I
too
don't
fine a
want a
point on it.
Gaddafi solution, but you know, that these people would talk some sense into him.
Politically knifed, not physically knifed. But
Yeah, exactly.
But to draw on one of the themes in Professor Orlovsky's remarks, I think before we get rid of the devil we know, we have to ask, well, who is going to be the replacement? Especially given the recurrent theme in Russian and Soviet history that when the Tsar is away or absent or incapacitated, there is this tremendous fear of chaos. And sometimes the fear of the chaos is as bad as the chaos itself. I mean, just to put it into terms of recent Soviet history, it was a point of tremendous concern in Soviet Ukraine when Nikita Khrushchev, a son of Ukraine, left power, when Leonid Brezhnev, with connections in Ukraine, left power, and the Dnepropetrovsk collective was no longer going to be represented in Moscow. And one of the concerns about Mikhail Gorbachev, at least from a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic standpoint, was he may have a Ukrainian relative, ancestor, but he's got no connection to Ukraine. So put that just into Russian perspectives, who's the replacement going to be? That's been what's kept Putin, I think, in power for so long that nobody can really conceive of one.
We've got a question, one more. I think we've got time for this last question from the audience here. And Rashida wants to know about whether Zelensky's background in acting has helped him to use media and PR to his benefit. And just as an aside, I would say it seems like there's no doubt about that. But also, if you could both address how Putin's background has affected his own the image that he projects, but also, you know, his own worldview. If you want to go first, Jeff.
I'll just say very quickly, since I realize time is pressing, there's one article that everybody should read. It would be an interview with Fiona Hill that was published recently in Politico. She will be known to everybody here from her work on the National Security Council, not to mention her other pursuits. But she really is one of these Russia watchers who's been watching this person in particular for a long time. And so I would defer to her view on that with regard to Putin's worldview. With regard to Zelensky, I mean, we've known since the Nixon-Kennedy debate that image, style, and ability to control the medium is extremely important. And so I'd say it certainly doesn't hurt that Zelensky has that background. But you know, we're talking about a very short span of time. It's been a week or two. And so he has to have more in his bag of tricks than a charismatic video persona. I grant him that, and I think it's wonderful that he's got it, but I'm hoping that there's more there.
Yeah, I would agree with what Jeff just said. But it is impressive that he's got through this week the way he has, given his background. I mean, no one took him seriously. No one took him seriously at all. I mean, it was a kind of a joke. But then again, when you look around the world and look who comes to power these days in lots of places, you kind of shake your head and wonder, you know,
it took real courage to stay in Kiev.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's still in danger, by the way. I mean, if the 40 miles of Russian tanks gets there, who knows what's going to happen. I hope he's got an exit plan. It's also fascinating to look at these dictators in Poland. Well, dictators is too strong a word. In Poland and Hungary, who were so anti-Western, anti-EU just a few days ago. Now that Russia is on the move, you know, their anti-Russianness is coming out again in a big way. Not unexpected. And one fears for people like the Finns and the Baltic, the Baltic states, who are extremely nervous about all this.
That's
So this
why-
is a watershed moment. Yeah.
And we should fear, because what is going to happen to NATO, to our commitments, if there is a massive cyber attack, say, on the central bank in Tallinn or on the electrical grid in Vilnius? If we march in and maintain our Article 5 commitments to NATO, we have now, I think, quite clearly, although Fiona Hill already thinks it started, World War III. If we don't go in, we have just shown that NATO is a lie.
Yeah. So we have to, I think. One hopes it doesn't come to that.
Absolutely. There's a lot more that we could say about this, and there's a lot more that's going to happen in the coming weeks, and hopefully we can do some more events like this at the Center for Presidential History as things develop. But I just wanted to thank Professor Khan and Professor Orlovsky for your time tonight, and the audience for your questions and for listening to us talk about this issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Everybody have a good night. Take care, and hope to see you all again soon.